Mount Pelée sat quietly on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean for a long time. Most people living nearby had no memory of it ever erupting. It had shown some signs of activity in the past, small eruptions in the years 1792 and 1851, but nothing that caused real fear. Because of this, people thought of the volcano as more of a natural landmark than a threat. Life in the town of Saint-Pierre, just over 6 miles south of the mountain's summit, went on as usual. It was a busy and beautiful place known as the Paris of the Caribbean, with shops, schools, a theater, and busy streets. In early April of the year 1902, a few locals noticed something odd. People hiking near the mountain reported strange smells like rotten eggs coming from the summit. These smells were from sulfur gases leaking out of small cracks called fumaroles. But sulfur fumes weren't all that new for the area, and no one thought much of it. That changed on April 23rd when the volcano let out its first real sign of trouble. A light rain of ash and small rocks fell on the southern and western sides of the mountain. Tremors shook the ground. People in the nearby villages felt it, but most still believed it would pass. By April 25th, a dark cloud of ash and rock shot up from the volcano's top. It looked frightening, but it didn't do much damage. Even then, local leaders didn't raise the alarm. On April 26th, another blast dusted nearby towns in gray ash. The volcano was clearly waking up, but officials continued to believe it posed no serious risk. 2 days later, on April 27th, a group of curious hikers made their way up to the summit. What they saw was shocking. The once dry Etang Sec crater was now a lake, boiling and steaming. A cone of volcanic debris, about 50 feet high, had formed beside it. Hot water poured into the lake, and the deep rumbling from below the earth sounded like a huge pot boiling over. The smell of sulfur had become so strong that it reached the streets of Saint-Pierre, causing people and animals to gag or flee indoors. By the end of April, rivers running down the mountain swelled. Some carried trees and boulders with them. Ash started falling steadily on villages like Précheur and Saint-Philomène. Even though these were clear warning signs, people living in and around Saint-Pierre still didn't leave. Many believed the volcano would settle down again, just like it had in the past. Others thought the city was too far from danger. After all, it was over 6 miles from the summit. On the night of May 2nd, around 11:30, the volcano exploded again. It sent out a huge black cloud of ash and pumice, and the explosions grew louder. The ground trembled. Ash rained down on the northern half of the island, and the air became hard to breathe. These blasts were now happening every 5 or 6 hours. Even with all of this happening, life in Saint-Pierre mostly went on as usual. People were nervous, but there was no order to leave, no official word telling them what to do. That weekend, a local newspaper decided to cancel a picnic planned for May 4th, just to be safe. It was one of the few signs that people were starting to worry. Farm animals, however, had already begun dying from starvation and thirst. Their food and water had been covered in ash, making it impossible for them to eat or drink. The island was clearly changing, but the people didn't fully realize what was coming. In the days ahead, things would go from bad to deadly. And yet, even as the ground rumbled beneath their feet and the sky darkened with ash, most people stayed put, unaware that their time was running out. By the end of April in the year 1902, the signs coming from Mount Pelée were growing harder to ignore. Even though many locals still believed there wasn't much to worry about, the mountain was changing quickly. Ash was falling almost daily, and the smell of sulfur filled the air around Saint-Pierre. Nearby rivers started to swell with muddy water, carrying fallen trees and rocks down from the slopes. On April 27th, some people climbed up to check out the Etang Sec crater. They found a lake of boiling water nearly 200 meters across, with steam hissing from deep underground and a strong sulfur smell in the air. That same smell drifted as far as the city of Saint-Pierre, which was over 6 kilometers away. Farm animals were beginning to suffer too. With ash covering the ground and falling into streams, there was no clean water or grass for them to eat. The air burned the lungs, and horses and cattle were getting sick or dying. Still, the local government didn't take serious action. The mayor and other officials were more focused on an upcoming election. Even though the volcano was getting louder and more aggressive each day, they insisted that everything was under control. On May 2nd, at around 11:30 at night, Mount Pelée let out a huge explosion. A thick black cloud of ash and smoke shot up into the sky. Earthquakes shook the ground, and the entire northern part of the island was soon covered in a layer of gray dust. The noise could be heard for miles, and even the ground itself seemed to be groaning under the pressure. But despite the chaos, people still stayed in the city. Some were scared but didn't know where else to go. Others simply trusted that the worst had passed. There were more explosions through the night and into the next day. Every 5 to 6 hours, the volcano would erupt again, the sky darkened, and the air was thick with ash. Even breathing became harder. Still, there was no official order to evacuate. Instead, there were efforts to calm the population. Newspapers printed updates but didn't sound the alarm. In fact, one local paper had planned a picnic on the mountain for May 4th, but ended up postponing it, not because of fear of the volcano, but because of poor visibility from the ash. On May 5th, things took a deadly turn. A powerful mud flow came rushing down the southwest side of the mountain. It smashed into a sugar mill, burying around 150 people and sweeping debris all the way to the sea. The mud flow hit the ocean with such force that it triggered 3 separate tsunamis. These waves damaged coastal buildings, sank boats, and caused panic among the people living near the water. That night, the volcano exploded again, but this time the clouds weren't just dark smoke. Parts of the eruption were glowing. Lava had finally reached the surface, marking a major shift in the eruption's behavior. By now, Mount Pelée was fully awake, and its power was growing. The eruptions were no longer just about steam and gas. Real magma was involved now, which meant the danger was about to reach a whole new level. And still, with everything that had happened, Saint-Pierre remained full of people. Residents, shopkeepers, families, and even refugees from nearby villages who thought the city would be a safe place to ride out the storm. They couldn't have known that they were waiting at the foot of one of the most deadly volcanic eruptions in modern history. By May 6th, the atmosphere in Saint-Pierre had shifted from nervousness to unease. The skies were darker than usual, filled with thick ash clouds that blocked out the sun. Street lamps stayed lit during the day, and layers of ash coated the rooftops, trees, and streets like gray snow. Breathing was difficult, and many people covered their faces with damp cloths. Horses, birds, and pets were found dead from the poor air quality, and the smell of sulfur never went away. Still, ships continued to arrive in the harbor, and life carried on as best as it could. Inside government buildings, officials tried to maintain order. The governor of Martinique, Louis Moutet, had recently visited the city with his wife. He wanted to reassure citizens that they were not in danger. He even moved into the city for a few days to calm fears. At the same time, reports were coming in from across the island about the mountain's activity, small earthquakes, boiling mud, glowing gas, and loud explosions, but the response remained the same: stay calm. Meanwhile, Mount Pelée was going through serious internal changes. A lava dome had begun forming inside the crater. This meant magma was rising to the surface, but being trapped beneath hardened rock. The pressure beneath this cap was increasing rapidly, and gas was building up faster than it could escape. On May 7th, another powerful explosion blew ash and rocks thousands of meters into the air. Some stones fell into the city, crashing through roofs and damaging homes. People were now seriously frightened, but most still remained. Many didn't have the means to leave, and others believed the worst had already happened. In the hills around the volcano, entire forests were dying from the toxic gases. Banana trees and sugar cane fields turned black. Streams ran hot, and fish floated to the surface, dead. The ground cracked in strange patterns, and wild animals fled or dropped where they stood. But inside Saint-Pierre, many still held on to hope. Markets were open, churches held services, and people tried to continue their lives even as the ground shook beneath them. On that same day, scientists visiting the area tried to gather data about the volcano's behavior. They noticed that the gas emissions were becoming more violent and that the shape of the crater had changed. But their warnings went mostly unheard. The newspapers printed short updates but downplayed the danger. There was a strong sense of denial throughout the island's leadership. In their view, Saint-Pierre was too important to lose. It was the economic and cultural heart of the island, and abandoning it would have been unthinkable. What no one realized was that Mount Pelée had become something far more dangerous than anyone had seen before. It wasn't just releasing steam and ash, it was preparing for a type of eruption almost no one on the island understood. And with each hour that passed, the force inside the mountain kept growing, pushing toward the moment when everything would change forever. On the morning of May the 8th, 1902, Saint-Pierre woke to a strange stillness. The usual tremors had stopped. The sky was heavy with ash, but there was no wind, no birds, and no sound from the mountain. Many residents took this quiet as a sign that the worst had passed. Others were too exhausted to think clearly, having spent the last several nights in fear. Despite the chaos of the past days, thousands still remained in the city, families, merchants, teachers, and workers who had nowhere else to go. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Mount Pelée unleashed one of the most violent eruptions in recorded history. Without warning, a massive explosion tore through the mountain's side. What followed was not lava, but a deadly blast known as a pyroclastic surge. A fast-moving cloud of superheated gas, ash, and rock that raced down the slope at speeds faster than any human could outrun. This surge reached Saint-Pierre in less than 1 minute. The wave of heat was so intense that it ignited everything in its path: wood, clothing, and even people. Buildings were flattened or caught fire instantly. Ships anchored in the harbor burst into flames. Stone structures crumbled, glass shattered. The surge didn't just burn, it crushed and suffocated. Those who tried to flee had no chance. The temperature of the cloud was high enough to kill instantly, and the pressure destroyed lungs before people could take their final breath. Within minutes, the entire city was in ruins. Fires broke out across neighborhoods, turning Saint-Pierre into a smoking wasteland. The eruption didn't stop there. It continued to release ash and gas into the atmosphere, covering the surrounding landscape in darkness. For those observing from other parts of Martinique, the view was horrifying. A giant black column rising from the volcano, shaped like a mushroom cloud, glowing with lightning and flame. In the days that followed, rescue teams arrived to search the wreckage. What they found was devastating. Of the nearly 30,000 people who had been in Saint-Pierre that morning, almost none had survived. The city, once called the Paris of the Caribbean, had been completely erased in less than 5 minutes. The only known survivor from the city center was a man named Ludger Silbaris, a prisoner locked inside a small windowless jail cell that protected him from the heat and ash. His survival was considered a miracle. Mount Pelée's eruption shocked the world. It was not just a natural disaster, it was a warning about how little was understood about volcanoes at the time. The pyroclastic surge, a type of eruption rarely documented before, introduced a new level of destruction that scientists would study for decades to come. But for Martinique, the loss was immediate and unforgettable. One of its most important cities had vanished, and the scars left behind would never fully heal. After the destruction of Saint-Pierre, the island of Martinique was left in mourning. Entire families were gone, and the cultural heart of the island had been wiped out. Survivors from nearby villages struggled to process what had happened. Many had lost loved ones, homes, and livelihoods in an instant. The scale of the disaster was hard to grasp, even for those who had seen the ash and flames with their own eyes. News of the eruption reached the rest of the world quickly. In France and across Europe, headlines described the death of a city. Relief efforts began almost immediately. Ships arrived carrying supplies, doctors, and volunteers. But there was little that could be done. The area around Saint-Pierre was still dangerous. Ash covered the ground like snow. Buildings were unrecognizable, and fires smoldered for days. It would take weeks to recover the dead, and in many cases, nothing remained to bury. One of the most notable outcomes of the disaster was the change it brought to scientific understanding. Geologists from different countries came to study the eruption and its aftermath. Mount Pelée became a key case for the study of pyroclastic flows, which had previously been misunderstood. Researchers also noted the strange weather that followed the eruption, including red sunsets and ash clouds that drifted across the Atlantic. The volcano's behavior helped shape modern methods of monitoring and predicting eruptions. Despite this progress, Mount Pelée remained active. Smaller eruptions occurred in the years that followed, including one in the year 1905. These events slowed the rebuilding process. Although a new settlement eventually formed near the ruins, Saint-Pierre never regained its former importance. The capital of Martinique was moved to Fort-de-France, where most government and trade activities remain today. The story of Saint-Pierre and Mount Pelée lives on through memorials, museums, and local storytelling. The preserved remains of the city still attract visitors who want to understand what happened on that terrible morning. The old prison cell where Ludger Silbaris survived can still be seen. His survival was used in traveling exhibitions, and he later joined a circus in the United States, where he shared his story. The eruption of May 8, 1902, stands as one of the deadliest volcanic events in history. It serves as a reminder of nature's unpredictable power and the importance of preparation. While Saint-Pierre could not have been saved with the knowledge of the time, the lessons learned from its loss have helped protect other communities around the world. Today, Mount Pelée is closely monitored, and the tragedy that once struck the island remains a powerful part of Martinique's identity.